One of the things that I like to ask students when we're talking about privilege and oppression is I ask them which group or which category is more oppressed. This is kind of a trick question because in feminist theory we actively critique people who try to rank oppression. One of the famous scholars, lesbian Chicana feminist writer Cheri Moraga wrote, she says, in this country, lesbianism and or queerness is a poverty, as is being brown, as is being a woman, as is being just plain poor. She cautions us though, and she says the danger lies in ranking the oppressions. The danger lies in failing to acknowledge the specificity of the oppression. The danger lies in attempting to deal with the oppression purely from a theoretical base. She says, without an emotional, heartfelt grappling with the source of our own oppression, without naming the enemy within ourselves and outside us, no authentic, non hierarchical connection among oppressed groups can take place. So she says a lot in this one quote, but essentially what she's telling us is that many of us experience discrimination in one or multiple different levels of our identities. For her, lesbianism was one of those ways that she experienced oppression. So she says lesbianism is a poverty, as is being brown, as is being a woman. However, she does not compete with one or the other. Like she does not say, for example, that her lesbianism was worse than her being a woman, or that being a woman is worse than being a person of color as a Latina. She says that all three of these things intersecting with each other are equally important. However, inevitably, whenever people take classes on privilege and oppression, they inevitably try to rank them. And so I use this activity that follows as kind of like to challenge it, but also to show that indeed there are people who have different struggles, and that even if you have one very powerful social category that creates oppression in your life, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are, quote, more oppressed than someone else who has that same category, or even less oppressed as that same social category. All of your identities have something to do with how you experience privilege and oppression. I'm going to use this as an example. Take the case of John. He is a black man, he's Christian, he's middle class, and he's straight. So, as a black man, he obviously experienced racism or colorism. As a middle class man, he is not a wealthy person, but he does have the privilege of having a middle class income and middle class identity that allows him access to places that, for example, poor and or working class people don't. His Christian identity might offer him some privilege in certain cases because we have a predominantly Christian society in the United States. It's very Christian centric. We have holidays like Christmas, like Easter, that people honor and respect. And it's also just by pure numbers, just something that is more acknowledged and recognized. So, however, there are many Christians that say that they have been criticized for their beliefs, and that they've been accused of being I don't know, they've either been unwanted or accused of a variety of things that Christians are stereotyped as. For in terms of his straight identity, that's called heterosexual privilege, right? And so when you compare that to a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person, John has privilege in terms of his sexual identity. Still, he experiences some oppression. And then you have Joseph. Joseph is an Asian man. He's Mormon. He's part of the working poor, and he's straight. So he has, for example, heterosexual privilege. Being an Asian man, sometimes being Asian can mean that you're experiencing oppression because you're not a white person in the United States. However, Asian, and specifically Asian American people in the United States, have been deemed for many years as a model minority, meaning that amongst minority groups, they have surpassed other people. In fact, in terms of income and in terms of educational outcome, Asian Americans in the United States tend to fare better even than most white people. And this is a complicated situation because being Asian can be both a privilege and oppression. And one of the common things that people think is that, quote, Asian people are just smarter. But when you unravel that research, you actually find that depending on what country you're from in Asia, which is a continent, not a country, a lot of people don't acknowledge that, there's a variety of diversity. There's a variety of diversity in terms of class and education. And most Asian Americans who do well in the United States come from a privileged background of education and in terms of money and in terms of migration. So you really don't know anything about Joseph. All you know is that he's Asian, but upon meeting him and upon learning of his identity, you make certain assumptions. And what I like to do is kind of piece that apart. So if you know that Joseph is both Asian and working poor and he's Mormon, then you know that he's not just dealing with privilege in terms of his identities. He's dealing with a lot of struggle as well. Then you go to Joey. Joey is an atheist. He's Latino. He's working class. He's gay. He struggles with PTSD, post traumatic syndrome, and so here you have yet another experience. Joey could have been middle class. He could have been upper class, but also be gay or have PTSD. Any one of those social categories can trump another, right? You don't know that by just meeting Joey. In fact, Joey might be a light skinned, what we call white passing Latino, right? So there's some Latinos, when you meet them, you might imagine that they're white people and you might imagine that they're privileged because of their whiteness. But then if you learn that one, they're Latinos, two, that they're gay or that they're from a working class background, then you start to figure out that this person is not who you may be assumed. And again, that his privileges and oppressions are very nuanced depending on who that person is, what they've been through, and they're both structural and individual levels of oppression. And then finally, you have Janet, who is a white woman. Again, you might see her as white privilege, but then you find out she's from the working poor, she's an immigrant, she's a lesbian, she's middle aged, she's Catholic. In any one situation, you might have imagined her as a person who has extreme privilege or a person who has extreme oppression. You'd have to know more about her before you made those assumptions. The point is that you should never make those assumptions, that you should learn more about these individuals before you sum up what their experience is.